We may cast.
Okay, so I have a bit of a disclaimer too. I tend to lose words. I have aphasia, which means that it's like tip of the tongue syndrome-ish. So sometimes I'll just be like, and I apologize, but it's gonna happen. So welcome to the Psychology of Fear. We're kind of just gonna start pretty simple. My part of it is very hard science kind of, and then Silas gets all the fun stuff, the subjective stuff. Callie has a sore throat and is taking it easy, and we're probably gonna cover her part another day. As for questions, we're gonna wait until the end of both presentations and then take questions. You feel free to like raise your hand or do the hand emoji or whatever, and even type the question if you want to. We'll try to scroll through, but we have to stop the recording before we answer questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So okay. To define fear, the American Psychological Association defines it as a basic intense emotion aroused by the detection of imminent threat, involving an immediate alarm reaction that mobilizes the organism by triggering a set of physiological changes. Merriam-Webster defines fear as an unpleasant, often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. We're going to go more towards the APA, American Psychological Association, definition and how it works, very, very briefly. Obviously, fear is processed in our brain. Our brain is the cortex, the thalamus, hypothalamus, and then little bits. One is called the amygdala. So our brains have these neural pathways. That's what the wrinkles are. And some of the pathways lead and converge into your amygdala, which is where fear stimuli is processed. So you see something scary or hear something scary, it comes into your brain as a stimulus. And if it's interpreted in your amygdala as a threat, then your amygdala pushes a reaction back to the body through your hypothalamus. And your hypothalamus triggers these physiological responses by messing with a variety of your glands. Your pituitary gland in your brain is a big one. So once your glands have released, hormones and neurotransmitters and all that fun stuff, you'll notice physiological changes. So this is not obvious, but there's a reason I'm going over it. A lot of the physiological changes actually help the organism to perform the fear response that they are innately programmed to do. So accelerated breath rate, hyperventilation, heart acceleration, muscle tension, which often causes piloerection, which is goosebumps, or in animals, it's when their fur stands up. The point of it is to make them look more scary. For us, goosebumps obviously looks weird and gross and doesn't do that, but that's what it's there for. Sweating, increased blood flow and pooling, hyperglycemia, which is increased blood glucose, dyspepsia, which is butterflies in your stomach. It's actually muscles and acid being released and all kinds of fun stuff. Bladder relaxation, that's a fun thing you can have your characters do. They can piss themselves. Loss of hearing, tunnel vision, and disinhibition of spinal reflexes. So I'm assuming that means like jelly legs. I actually forgot to research what that meant. Oops. So, yeah, so all this stuff happens because glandular production of hormones and neurotransmitters are creating a variety of responses, and each response is different for each person because, you know, our brains are all slightly different from each other, and someone might create more of a hormone that does one thing or another. So when that comes to characters, you can kind of decide, you know, are they gonna faint? Are they going to have that loss of hearing, that tunnel vision? Um, are they going to have the muscle tension and more of like a um, pounce, you know, fight this thing response? So that moves us on to the fear responses, which I'm sure you've heard of fight or flight, but there are actually four. There is fight, flight, freeze, and faint. Faint is an actual fainting response. Yep, the four Fs. And I was researching a little bit, decided not to go down a rabbit hole about it, but it appears to be because hyperglycemia, the blood glucose, um, creates blood pressure to drop too rapidly. And so some people faint, and that is their fear response, and that has to suck. Yeah, definitely diabetics know about that. Freeze is the inability to move. I didn't research it too much. I have a lot of links if you guys want to know more about why, but I didn't want to bother you with that stuff. So flight is the urge to flee, and fight is the urge to attack or to physically interact and deal with the fear stimulus. So I wanted to give you an example. When I um, have like a fear response, my initial reaction is freeze because I get tunnel vision and I get loss of hearing. That writes itself pretty quickly, um, you know, a second or two. And then my next response is fight. Fight often means for me putting out a fire. So I'm not actually fighting the fire, but it's like I'm taking care of that instead of running away from it. Um, so for characters, you can always decide like, how are you going to pile on these reactions? How are you going to walk your reader through a very visceral response to the really scary thing that you came up with? The psychological side of these responses, we've learned that there are innate fear responses that happen physiologically, and those responses can change through learned behavior over time and also are affected by external factors. Um, so a variety of components can change over or override a person's innate reaction to the fear stimulus. There's perception of control, which is the belief in ourselves over the fear stimulus. We might feel overpowered, more powered than them. It's not from learning, it's from just our belief, our self-esteem or delusion, maybe. Um, the second is content specificity. That is learned reactions from results of previous interactions with a fear stimuli or from rational learning. For example, I would take care of a grease fire by putting it out, you know, with baking soda or something. But if I came into my kitchen and the kitchen was on fire, I would run. I would not try to put out that fire because I do not have a fire hose or, you know, I'm not a firefighter. So it's like knowing whether or not you can handle your monster. The third thing is social information processing, and that is learned opinions about a particular fear that makes us more or less hostile towards it, or contextual reactions based on social situations and pre-existing thoughts. So that's a pretty deep concept to go into. I didn't really want to do more than brush over it, but if you want to understand more about how your character might, especially if it's battling something over and over again, definitely look into the social information processing of fear, because that learning, that changes everything over time. Um, so then we can move on to, I see a lot of people typing. Is everything going okay? Can someone give me like a thumbs up or something?
We can hear you. You're good.
Am I going too fast?
You're good, Kris. It's fine. We can get you.
Okay.
Understand.
So fear conditioning is something that we go through. It's a behavioral paradigm in which organisms learn to predict aversive events. So it's how you learn what to fear if it's not obvious, I guess, is the best way of explaining fear conditioning. There are a lot of really horrible, I've lost my word, studies. There are a lot of studies that psychologists and scientists used to do. I am not going to cover them. They're widely available and they will make you sad. But that's how we learned that we learn fear. It is the mechanism behind phobias, behind association disorders, behind post-traumatic stress disorder. And research has shown that fear memories are stored and recalled differently in the brain than non-fear memories. So, if you're really writing a horror where your character is being repeatedly, I can't find the right word, brought up to task against a horror, a monster, anything, their reactions are going to change. And in certain people, they are going to begin to fear the idea of coming up against this thing again. So what I feel like is missing in a lot of horror is trauma, and is a real reaction to a horrible situation that is not superhero, beating it down and being done. So look into fear conditioning if you really want to bump up your horror responses in your characters. My last little tidbit is called terror management theory. I'm doing a very short overview. It is a pretty new theory from 2015. It's a social evolutionary theory proposed by Greenberg, Solomon, and Pazinski that proposes that psychological conflict results from having a self-preservation instinct while realizing that death is inevitable and unpredictable. And they call this death anxiety. I feel like this theory just hits the nail on the head when it comes to understanding how to make your horror story realistic. I mean, who has not felt that duality of I want to survive, but at some point I'm going to die. So the way that people deal with death anxiety has to do with their perceptions of mortality and death. There's an evolutionary backdrop um, that appears different in different cultures. There's culturally specific funeral rites. There's beliefs about our existence and specific afterlives. There's glorification of a meaningful death, like warrior cultures, like Vikings, Maori, I think, as well. And then beyond the evolutionary, cultural backdrop, there's personal self-esteem. There's a belief in your own ability to survive, or a belief in the significance of your death. Your personal belief in the importance of your death inside a cultural worldview. So a soldier, or a noted figure, someone who is going to be glorified after they give up their life for their culture, for their purpose. All of these things affect how a person deals with their death anxiety. There's also mortal salience, which is a fancy word for the belief in your safety based on your reckless testing of death, like jumping off of a bridge into a river, and that thrill, and so you feel like, oh, I can do that every time. Or stupid stuff like sun tanning with lotion, even though you know that you could get skin cancer, but that doesn't really go with horror so much. But mortal salience is, oh, I beat this monster once, I'm going to get cocky about it. So I'm not going to be so anxious the next time. And then there's death thought accessibility, which is the ability to cognitively understand death anxiety. So, you could have a character who just doesn't really think about that kind of stuff and really is just going to do what they need to do, and not be affected by their own mortality. The relationships between self-perception and terror management, they create a management system, like a thought process, decision-making system specific to an individual. And it dictates how an individual responds to a fear stimuli. So that system, I feel, translates really well to character creation and character continuity, and depth, because you can really create somebody who reacts appropriately in a story. The reader is going to notice those nuances. The reader is going to connect to those nuances because that is how we function. So when you're writing, consider the physiological reactions. I see a lot of hyperventilation, a lot of heart beating. What else? What else does your character or characters go through? How does their upbringing change their fight, their flight, their freeze, their faint? How does a fainting person cope with surviving a horror? Um, and then with terror management, I have a document here I'm going to link. It's what I'm reading off of, and it has my references and it has further study, because terror management theory, I'm its newest fan. I feel like that's really going to help people understand how to write a great character or characters who have realistic responses to fear, and the readers can hook onto that. And that is my part of the presentation. So now Sighluss is going to talk about how to make scary monsters to be afraid of.
All right, thank you, Kris. That was great. I
Thanks.
really enjoyed that. I just want to start off by sharing a story of a time that my fear response was engaged. So I was motorcycling across the country during summer in college, as an angsty college boy does. And I decided to go camping in the mountains of Colorado, somewhere around Rico, Colorado. And I set up camp, and it's quiet. It's really quiet. I'm in my tent. I'm in my sleeping bag. I have the drawstrings tied up where I can't even see outside the tent. And I'm laying there and I'm about to fall asleep when I hear what sounds like walking in the snow around me. Immediately, you know, my hair's starting to stand up. I could feel myself, feel my heart rate increasing, kind of hyperventilating. And I notice that these footsteps sound like there's only two footsteps. So I go down to the bottom of my bag and I grab my knife that I carry with me because I'm in the wilderness. I gotta have a knife. And they're getting faster. I'm hyperventilating. I'm getting myself ready to fight whatever this is, whoever this is. And it's getting faster and faster, closer and closer. And then it just keeps getting louder and louder, like someone's marching outside my tent. And I realize it's my eyelashes scratching the nylon sleeping bag. And I just got myself hyped up for that. So I never had been in a place so quiet where I could hear it scraping, my eyelashes scraping on a nylon sleeping bag. And then I realized all these feelings I had were like my natural body's responses to maybe being stalked or being potentially in that situation. And I draw on that a lot whenever I do writing. But onto my section. So before I begin, I want everyone to know that I'm going to be covering some things that have been outright disproven and have very little empirical evidence behind them. We're going to be talking about Freud. Now, we're going to, in particular, Freud's idea of the psychic apparatus. Now, we're going to leave a lot of Freud's ideas and hypotheses behind because all of you know, like, cigar is just a cigar with Freud, right? So we're going to leave that behind, the cocaine use behind, all of that. We're going to look at the psychic apparatus and how we can use it through a lens to view monsters and what makes them tick, and even motivations of people. We're going to cover 4 monsters. We'll talk about the balance of the psychic apparatus and the cinematic versions of these monsters. I would have read horror novels for each of these monsters, but I really did not have time to read all of them. So, what is the psychic apparatus? It's basically Freud's idea that is supposed to explain how a subconscious interacts with the outside world. His thought is that it's a central apparatus that would control interactions between smaller apparatuses and the unconscious. The neural, the language, memory, basic drives of a person, like chasing satisfaction, and then the constant stimuli of waking life. Now, the psychic apparatus was either expanded or replaced, depending on which egghead you ask, by the id, the ego, and the superego model, which now is usually called ego psychology. Now, ego psychology is the idea that there are these layers of consciousness and unconsciousness that reason and interact with one another. Now, the layers are fluid and they flow between positions of dominance and subdominance, depending on a number of factors. So let's go through the layers, and I promise I'll come around to how this applies to horror and writing in general. The first layer we've got is what Freud calls the id. Now, the id is an instinctual part of your personality. You're basically born with the id. It tells you what your body needs, what your body wants. It's responsible for impulses and desires. This, and Freud wants us to note that it's especially in the case of aggression and libido. Now, this brings us to what's called the pleasure principle, which is pretty simple. It goes like this: I want my pleasure now, and I want to stay away from things that cause me pain. Now, he argues you're born with this, meaning that kids below the age of 2 are all in. They just want things that they want. They just want to do things that they want to do. They don't know values, no good and evil, no morality. Now, if you're a parent, you might see how it can cause a problem if your little one only had what they deemed pleasurable. If they had their way, they'd only be eating chocolate chip cookies and drinking chocolate milk, which would sustain them, but not comfortably. They'd feel like crap after probably 2 days of that. Which brings us to the second part of this apparatus, which is the ego. So the ego today is the word ego has a negative connotation, but it's arguably the most important part of Freud's apparatus, his trinity, if you will. Now, what the ego does is says, boy, id, settle down for a sec. If we get the stuff to make our own chocolate chip cookies, we can have better cookies, like twice as many for the same price, and get our favorite Ovaltine powder for chocolate milk, which is, by the way, a good source of 12 vitamins and minerals and has no artificial sweeteners or flavors. Great. So the id uses what's called the reality principle, which is basically the ego seeking to give the id what it wants in realistic ways with long-term benefits and less grief. So it's have you ever done something as a gut wrench reaction that you regretted almost immediately afterwards? Well, that was your id taking over from the ego for a second. So it bargains between this insatiable desire to have what we want constantly and what is actually possible and what is actually good in the long run. We will come back to the ego in a second. We're going to jump on to superego. Now, superego is really interesting because it's kind of really subjective, depending. You'll see. So, it's superego is cultural values and rules, and is you take it into you and becomes part of your consciousness and your subconsciousness. So, the superego is incredibly malleable person to person because it changes with your location, your culture, even the way you're raised. Like your superego is your morality, and it changes to everyone. Even if your neighbor was raised at the same time as you, in the same place as you, their superego is going to tell them something different. Now, superegos are mainly taught by parents in like your time growing up, and he argues that your superego uses guilt to punish the ego when it misbehaves and rewards it with pride when it does behave. So if we look at the cookie analogy, what if you go to the store or you go to every store in your area and you buy all the cookie making supplies and all the Ovaltine powder in your area? Would your superego shame you because you took away all the cookie making supplies from everyone around you? I think mine would. Mine would. It would shame me for being selfish. So, like the id though, the superego has no sense of reality. It wants what your morals would consider being perfection. So it wants you to always do what you consider to be right. And that is really how you get like perfectionists and OCDs and stuff like that. That's what Freud says anyway. I remember Freud has been widely disproven. And then it comes back to the superego to mediate this, or the ego to mediate the superego the same way it has to do with the id. So the superego, if it's heard too much, you may have unrealistic expectations for yourself, unrealistic expectations for others, and that can be problematic just as much as being impulsive and like the id. So you really need this balance between your ego, your id, and your superego. So now we're going to come back to how we can apply this to writing. We're going to start with looking at horror. Now, uncontrolled primal urges from the id is a pretty scary idea on its own. Like people that just do things they want to do, no matter what the consequences in the moment. It's pretty scary. It's like how road rage happens. You get mad, you go out and you do stupid murder. Yeah, it's a crime of passion, they say. And it's dismissible, like I had a moment of madness, and that's been a defense in court before. It's scary that that can be dismissed when really it's kind of a fault of yourself. Well, not in all cases. So I'm going to take this a step further in using this analogy, Freud's psychic apparatus, right? Imagine a grown man who has power and wealth to do realistically anything he wants. So his id can get anything he wants constantly. Now, the ego would tell him strategies to get what he wants. So he's already got the drive to get something and the strategy to get that same thing. Normally, this is where the ego would come in and ask him if his strategy was moral and if him doing what he's doing is moral. If not, obviously, has a choice whether to continue despite what the superego says, and he might feel conflicted. Now, let's take the same man. The id has given him the desire to do something. The ego has given him a cutthroat strategy on how to get it, but except this time, instead of his superego coming in to challenge the id and the ego, imagine this man was raised by a father that taught him might is right. Meaning, if you have the power to do something, that means it's moral to do that something. This is how you get dictators. This is how you get power hungry businessmen. There's all kinds of examples in the world around us. And these people are real world monsters. They do what they want and they don't feel any remorse for it. I mean, I can think of a few examples myself. I won't name them, but everyone just think about that person that you're thinking about and these people that you're thinking about. Now, there we have an equation for monsters. Strong id plus strong ego plus strong superego equals equals motivated for action, organized for action, and filled with conviction for action. Now, this is where the superego really has to be developed at a young age for morals that represent like the community. There are some people that live outside of that community and they may not have the same morals as you. Then that's what makes some monsters scary. They might not see the sanctity of life, for instance, or the sanctity of human life. But what other equations can we get? Let's look at some movie monsters as a thought exercise. I chose 4 classics: zombies, werewolves, vampires, and demons. And I looked at one film that kind of defines the idea of that monster for each of these monsters. So zombies, I went with Romero's 1968 Night of the Living Dead. Now, for those of you that have not seen it, this movie starts out with like a satellite or a meteorite going overhead, and radiation affects people and reanimates them. Right now, these zombies don't want brains; they want human flesh in general. They don't care about anything. They just walk around and look for flesh. They might, walk off a cliff. They don't really have reasoning behind what they're doing. So it seems like they're just id devoid of ego and superego. Basically like a very dumb animal, which that's what part of what makes zombies scary. They're just a whole bunch of things that all want the same thing. Like a horde of just people wanting the low prices at Walmart on Black Friday. That's terrifying, especially if you're a worker that has to open those doors, right? All right, let's look at werewolves. I did The Wolfman in 1941, which I did not realize how much symbolism is in the Wolfman 1941, and I might have to come back one day and just do a talk on symbolism in film and how to apply that to writing, because this film is fantastic, and in my opinion, it holds up today, minus some minor racist details that it has. So the superego has our main character protect a woman on his way home. When he's protecting this woman, he's protecting him from a wolfman. He gets bit, but in the process of the struggle, he defeats this wolfman with a silver cane that has the head of a wolf on it. Ooh, symbolism. Now, he goes home. He's been told about the myth. He doesn't think anything's going to happen. He transforms. His ego loses all bargaining power with his id, and he kills someone he knows. I think it was the gardener's son. And he's kind of dealing with the idea of I am a monster, and there's footprints leading to his room that's actually in his room muddy wolf footprints. Now, towards the end of the film, after he's emotionally coming to grips of him being a monster, people are out hunting for this werewolf, and his dad's gonna go out and hunt for the werewolf, right? So he goes to his dad, and his dad's like, "You're not a wolf, man. Calm down, bro." And he goes, "Dad, whatever you do, just take this silver cane with you to protect you when you go out." His dad's like, "Okay, I'll humor you. I'll take the silver cane." That night, he turns back into a wolf. It is reigning supreme over the ego and the superego. Now, him giving that cane to his father was his superego and his ego making a plan to make it right, make everything he's done right. Now, our main character, his name's Larry, I'm pretty sure. He goes out and he attacks the very woman he saved in the very beginning of the movie. And his father strikes him down with the very cane he used to strike down the original Wolfman. Now, there's a whole bunch of symbolism to unpack from this movie that is just fantastic. But what you get from it is a cycle of conflict between the three members of his apparatus, which is great. It's a great way to look at conflict in stories, conflict in character arcs, and in horror, the id is terrifying. But in my opinion, if the id is backed up by the superego and the ego, that's scarier. Which brings us to vampires. I watched 1931's Dracula. Great film. It's shot kind of like a play. Not a lot of moving shots. I think there's maybe 3 moving shots. It does not hold up, but the Spanish version is better, much better. So Dracula in this film, I don't think he sees the humans as equal. I think he sees them more as possessions and meals. Now, is that a lack of his superego? I'm not sure. Would he treat other vampires the same way if they exist? Do vampires have a moral system? I really can't tell. But what we do know he has is lust, hunger, and anger, which are all very human emotions, which are all components of the id, right? But he deliberately uses his ego to plan things, and then he feeds his id. So the question is, does he think what he's doing is morally right, and does that make him the trifecta that my original example was, like the might is right? I think so. I think he thinks that he's doing the right thing by preserving himself. And that I think that's why this version of Dracula is scary. Now we're gonna move on to yeah, Predator from the Predator films. He's fully actualized. He's going he's doing what he thinks is right. He's doing what he wants, and he has a plan to do it. So, an examination of demons. I looked at The Exorcist in 1973. I forgot how disgusting the film was. Now, seemingly the demon has no other drive than it in this movie, but then I watched it again. And you routinely see the demon demonstrate its ability to wait for the right moment to trigger our characters. I don't know how many of you guys have watched it, but it covers a priest that is also a psychologist, right? And he's having a struggle of faith. He lost his mother, and it's really sad. So the demon continuously prods his faith. It fakes getting hit, fakes pain when he gets hit by tap water. The demon does, which challenges his faith versus science, and which is it's a really cool move by the demon, right? So is that ego to to plan the best way to get what he wants, which is suffering? I think so. Now, I think the demon is also it has the opposite values of humans. Generally, humans don't really want to cause suffering. Oh, most humans don't want to cause suffering. Let's say that. So I really think this demon has his ego, his super ego, and his id all in alignment. And to me, that makes it one of the most terrifying monsters there is because it it is a balanced creature, and that's what makes it a formidable foe. Now, does the demon ultimately succeed? Not really. Our main character kind of transfers the demon into himself and jumps out a window. So, eh. Oh, sorry, spoilers from a 50-year-old movie. So ultimately, the lens of an outdated psychoanalysis technique can help you build characters, monsters, define their motivations, and map their decisions. You can shuffle these equations a number of times to get different story arcs each time. Another example I like to use is Star Wars. So the Jedi are supposed to represent the superego, the Sith are the id. But both of those extremes are kind of really un unhealthy. That's the reason why the Jedi fall, because they have unrealistic expectations. And then the Sith, they're just all id, man, and they use ego to plan an ultimate like take over the galaxy, but like I think the I think ultimately they failed because neither one of them like are balanced. They're not balanced ideologies. So both are terrible extremes to live in. It's safer to stay somewhere in the middle. Now, does Freud's hypothesis explain real human turmoil accurately? No, not by a long shot. But it works as a great tool to kind of understand like a inner human turmoil. And I think that's where I'm going to end. We can end the recording now, Chris.